and thanks for coming out. My name is Colleen Marchand. I work for the Okanagan Indian Band in the Territorial Stewardship Division. I'm the director for that division. I'm also assisting with the planning for any emergencies that we may experience out here, and I usually act in the role of the EOC director when we have an emergency operations center up and running. So we've invited everybody here tonight to listen to a presentation from Jen Clark, who did a post-hazard assessment of our area, our watersheds after the fire to identify concerns. We'll let Jen present and there'll be questions, but we are going to open with a prayer. And I'm going to call on Julie Richard, as soon as she's ready. Julie, to do the prayer, the opening prayer, please.
Tonight we're here to offer our thanks for the food, our community members that have turned out to learn more information about this post-wildfire disaster. Keep them in your prayers as they travel home tonight. And we pray that this summer, the spring, this year is safe for everyone, safe for our community and our families and our loved ones.
Thank you, Colleen. My name is Jennifer Clark, and I'm a professional geoscience consulting out of Kelowna. I was hired by the Ministry of Forests, Lands and Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development to conduct a post-wildfire natural hazard risk assessment for the areas affected by the White Rock Lake fire. I'd like to acknowledge that Colin Marchand of the Territorial Stewardship Office accompanied me in the field, and I'm grateful for his knowledge. I was also provided maps, drone imagery, and historical flood history from the band. So I'm grateful for that, and thank you for inviting me here tonight. Immediately after the fire, the province initiates a reconnaissance level assessment of a fire area, the area burned. And they do this by helicopter, and it's an overview assessment where they fly the area and look at the slopes, look at the streams, and look at the areas affected downslope and downstream to determine a risk rating. White Rock Lake fire in particular, the Okanagan side of the fire was rated high risk because of the area affected and the community at risk. So they hired me to conduct a detailed assessment, and this assessment was a on the ground assessment of those hazards. So the objectives were to identify and evaluate natural hazards in those Okanagan Lake catchments, and to evaluate the risk to residents, structures, roads, and infrastructure. I was also asked to provide conceptual level recommendations for mitigating those risks. And I say conceptual level because many times more information is needed to come up with engineering designs. So it just gives a high level sense of what could be done. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the White Rock Lake fire, but I'll remind you that it was affected an area over 800 square kilometers, and it extended from the north end of Okanagan Lake all the way through Monty Creek and heading halfway to Kamloops. The map here shows the perimeter of the area burned, and for the scope of my work was to look at about half of that area, so that the eastern half of this perimeter, which drains eastward into the lake. So that includes the Whiteman Creek watershed, the Neswito Creek watershed, Equesis or 6 Mile watershed, and then all the smaller areas in between. Tonight I'm focusing on the Bradley, Newport, Irish Creek area and the areas in between, and the previous 2 nights I gave presentations on those other areas. So tonight I'll focus on those upper watersheds. The map, the image that you see here also shows vegetation burn severity in the different colors. So the red color is at a high vegetation burn severity, and then the other colors, orange, yellow, green, are a lower level of burn severity. Now, the reason why that is important is at high burn severity, which this photo shows you an example area, there is this total loss of forest and understory. So that's all the shrubs underneath the trees, all the needles, all the mossy, shrubby layer underneath the trees. The trees are black. If you look out on the slope, you'll see black areas, and then you'll see areas that are yellow because the needles have stayed on the trees. This here is a high burn severity, and depending on the severity, it signals a response to water and to how the landscape will respond to runoff. And that runoff could be generated by snowmelt. It could also be generated by rainfall. So fire affects hydrology and water flow by increasing the flow and by increasing rates of runoff, which can also mobilize sediment and debris where it's flowing. The other thing that a high burn severity fire can do is it can affect the texture and chemical composition of the soil. So in some areas, high burn severity can lead to the development of water repellent soils or hydrophobic soils. And the photos here show the results of a field test, a water percolation field test, where a strip of soil is cleared off of any needles or material so that the mineral soil is exposed. And then a volume of water is poured across that surface and timed to measure how long it takes for that water to absorb into the ground. And through various bits of published literature, we can kind of know that at 40 seconds or anything greater than 40 seconds signals the development of these soils. And these photos here show the soils after 40 seconds. So in the photo on the right, you can see a little bit better how the water sort of pools on the surface. So this is concerning for some areas where we have high burn severity. What kind of impacts might you expect to see? It very much depends on the landscape and what happened to the fire. But I'll give you an example from the 2017 Elephant Hill fire. This was flooding that occurred the next year, where the creeks coming down open up into a fan area, similar to what we see here at Okanagan Lake, where a broad fan area becomes filled with sediment, and then the flow is redirected across that fan area depending on, basically the path of least resistance. So what can happen is you can have culverts that plug, culverts that are areas of roads that traverse the fan are inundated and covered with sediment. On steeper slopes, the example on the farthest to the left shows some post-fire examples from the US. On a steeper slope where you have water running off down a channel, it can erode down, and so you have scour and basically sediment being moved from those steeper areas to the valley bottom. So that the examples in the middle and on the right show you how sediment deposits in the valley bottom areas. And in the center photo, you can see too how the bark is scoured off the trees, which signals a higher clear water flow, and then the sediment is deposited. Once the flood is over, you're left with this sediment in the valley bottom. I also wanted to point out that you can have effects of fire that occur long distances from where the fire actually occurred. So even though it may have been far up in the watershed, those changes can make their way down to unburned areas. As I mentioned tonight, I'm going to be talking about this northern part of the area affected by the fire, and I've just roughly outlined some of the catchments. So there's Bradley Creek or Dry Creek, the furthest south, just north of 6 Mile Creek. And then there's a small catchment called Newport, which is in between. And then Irish Creek, which is a larger watershed, which we can see right out the window here, which flows down into a valley bottom before it meanders and makes its way to the north end of the lake. So I'll be talking to you about what I saw, giving you some photos, and what the results of the assessment were. I've also posted the large posters of the maps that came out of the report, and there's two. There's one that shows kind of the big area altogether, and then another one that focuses on the downslope area where the risks were rated. So first of all, Bradley Creek or Dry Creek is named that way because I think it mostly is a perennial stream, or it doesn't flow year round, it goes dry. And I think it's actually a little bit to the north of that first photo, but the area is characterized by a dry, open forest, grassland, but in the upper part of the watershed, beyond where the photo shows, it plateaus out and you have kind of the snow accumulation zone. The water runs off down into the channels that are full of riparian vegetation before it reaches West Side Road and eventually across a flatter slope to the lake. And then the photo on the right shows you a view north of the slopes just south of Newport Creek, and you can see the areas that were burned along the slope there. This is a look at the high burn severity area in the Newport Creek region, where you can see a fairly high degree of burn. OKIB did some post-wildfire drone imagery, so there is very good imagery for the burned area. And I just want to show you kind of a close-up of this area near Newport Creek because the area experienced some small debris events the fall of last year. So in mid-November, rainstorm caused some small sediment-laden debris floods and small debris flows down the slope. The image here, it kind of looks like there's this line where it's like burned and then unburned. That's just overlapping two sets of imagery. So the drone imagery only goes to that line, and then the rest predates the fire. But I'll zoom in on this area where there's a square. Again, looking closely at the blackened high burn severity area. And even from a drone, you can see the channels forming on top of the soil surface. So these are channels that formed from runoff from a rainfall, and they are already forming and developing channels due to increased rates of runoff, possibly water repellent soils, and exposed mineral soils. There's also heat fracturing of bedrock that can occur when the fire creates such an intense heat that rocks are shattered. So again, that creates material that can be mobilized downslope. These are some photos of that mid-November event where material flowed down towards homes. And the example in the middle shows how maintaining clear drainage is so important, because just from a small event, you can see that a driveway culvert was completely plugged. So these form, can mobilize sediment downslope. Very quickly after that event, OKIB was able to complete some risk mitigation work to provide some protection for the homes. And these photos show some ditches and small berms that were built to channelize flow away from homes and maintain drainage on the fire guards and exposed areas downslope. So moving a little bit further north into the Newport Creek watershed, here's some photos that show the view of the watershed with West Side Road at the bottom of the photo. There's a large agricultural field that makes up most of the fan. The creek flows through the forest in the center, down the center of the fan, and you can see the burned areas up above. And the photo on the right-hand side shows the headwater areas of Newport Creek that were burned, and even in early November, there was snow starting to accumulate, and this forms, again, the snow accumulation zone where snowmelt becomes a driver for flooding events. On Newport Creek fan, we also look at evidence of past events, to get a sense of what will happen. We want to know what has happened before and what physical characteristics of the watershed can signal future potential events. So evidence such as large boulders on the fan create a sense of scale for what kind of power is possible in a steep watershed. And then the photo on the right shows the culvert that was in place at the time that I did the original field work. And just today I snapped a photo of the new culvert that was put in at Newport Creek. Not sure how the sizing was determined. This is Ministry of Transportation that put that in just recently. And then on the upper part of the fan, this was after the mid-November debris flow events. Because of a concern for debris flows on Newport Creek, a row of lock blocks were put in at the top end of the fan to encourage containment within the channel and to discourage the creek from avulsing or changing direction as it came down, if a large event came down. It did not experience any event in the fall or through the winter, so this is intended to be a protective structure in the interim until some more work can be completed. And then moving north again, there are some burn slopes between Newport Creek and Irish Creek. I don't have a great photo of them, but you drive right past them as you come down. There are some small channels that drain onto the slopes above West Side Road. And then this is a view of the Irish Creek area. Basically the slopes that you can see here on the south side of the watershed. The area on the north side of the watershed was not burned. So this forms the boundary of the fire. And the fire burned several small steep catchments that may or may not have some concern for a debris flow or debris flood event. But the Irish Creek watershed was pulled out for analysis because it flows down through the community here at the north end of the lake. These are some photos of Irish Creek crossing at West Side Road. I think Irish Creek loses a lot of water as it flows through the broad valley. So by the time it reaches West Side Road, it's fairly small. That said, there's 3 kind of small-ish culverts, and the photo on the right shows the downslope side of the culvert, which has kind of a big scour hole. So this is flagged for MOT to have a look at as well. So what happens in this kind of post-wildfire natural hazard risk assessment is that 2 components are brought together. The first side is the hazard part of the equation. So what is the likelihood of flooding? What is the likelihood of debris flow? What is the likelihood that we're gonna have some kind of damaging process occur because of the fire? The second part of the equation is, well, if that event does occur, what is the likelihood that somebody is going to be affected or something, whether that's infrastructure, homes, property, other elements at risk. And so through input from Okanagan Indian Band, we were able to identify elements at risk, whether they're culverts or whether they're structures, and this risk mapping was done. So they're also posted on the walls, and I welcome any questions. The way it works is those 2 components are put together, and a risk rating is assigned. So the purple areas, depending on how dark the color is, right, gives the risk rating. So in the purple letters, you can also see Bradley Creek has a fan area outlined in red dashed, rated very high risk. The areas that experience the mid-November debris flows are also rated very high. There's portions of Newport Creek that are rated anywhere between moderate to very high. And moving northward on West Side Road, those small areas were rated high, but not very high because of the hazard level. And then again, the red dashed lines show the fan areas that are more likely to receive some larger event. But of course, water flows downhill and it eventually reaches the north end of the lake, where we've identified culverts and things such as that need to be aware of high flows. So, yes, we got on the field, we had a look around, we looked at probabilities of things happening, but I wanted to point out too that there is a fair amount of uncertainty related to the analysis, and that this uncertainty can be classified in terms of 2 things. One is the climate, and the other is the impact. So first of all, there's climate uncertainty. We don't know what, you know, when I completed this report in the fall, we had no idea what the winter was going to bring in terms of snowpack. We now know, based on the March 1st bulletin, that snowpacks in the Okanagan are lower than normal. We're sitting at about 86%, and the next bulletin is due to come out any day now. I suspect it's also going to be a little bit below normal. That said, on some of these smaller catchments, snowpack is probably already mostly gone, and the hazards in those small catchments that tend to be steeper are more likely to be driven by intense rainfall events through the summer. So when we get those really strong localized cells that move over the valley, those are the types of events that can trigger debris flows or landslides. So now that we've identified this uncertainty, we need to understand how we will address that uncertainty. And the recommendation is to monitor, increase awareness and monitor these conditions. So through the River Forecast Center, which publishes these snow bulletins, the band can be aware through regular communication with EMBC and through communication with others knowledgeable about the area, there can be awareness to what the potential for a flooding event might be. And then the other component of uncertainty is related to the impacts. So I mentioned before, although my project was a detailed assessment, it's still at a level high enough that I didn't go to specific properties and rate a specific risk at a specific property. It's intended to be interpreted at a large level. And of course, every site has a specific site condition. You know, if the house was built up, if there's a ditch that runs along the driveway, like there's various things that can affect whether a property is at risk or not. So again, how do we deal with that level of uncertainty? Becoming aware, and then also preparing. So this is where the OKIB emergency response planning comes in, because they're taking this information and developing plans to stage sandbag stations, or to obtain tiger dams, or to develop emergency response plans so that the community knows what to do in the event of emergency. So from the recommendations for this report, that came out of this report, that are specific to the Newport Creek area, Newport Irish Creek area, are divided into short-term recommendations and long-term. Over the short term, which was, you know, started in the winter and continues now, there is message distribution, getting the message out, providing information on emergency response, increasing frequency of monitoring and inspection, getting that out. So you're all here tonight, you know, achieving that one of the first goals from this report. Understanding that by preparing, you know, anticipating increased runoff, we can then better protect everything. Ministry of Transportation Highways has a copy of the report, and they're aware of the vulnerabilities, so that is being done right now in anticipation of spring. Also underway, some work is already underway to address the long-term recommendations, and that includes a debris flow hazard assessment, risk assessment, to look at Newport Creek in particular, where there is a potential for debris flow, to look at what the volumes might be, velocities, and then to prepare engineered designs for protection. For some of these smaller face unit areas, like those slopes south of Newport or north of Newport, or Dry Creek in there, the recommendations are also quite similar. It doesn't have the same debris flow risk, but again, awareness, keeping ditches and culverts open to ensure clear passage, and protecting assets if they're at risk. And the long term, reducing the potential for soil erosion and sediment transport. This could get into some maybe big picture mitigation, such as reforestation, grass seeding, and other kind of types of work to stabilize unstable areas. So it kind of wraps up my report. I remind you that, you know, the areas affected by fire may potentially have post-wildfire natural hazards, such as flooding, landslides, debris flow. Work is underway to address the recommendations of the report, and it's important to be aware. Leaving you with a photo of hope, where even from last fall there was some green coming up. So we'll expect to see post-wildfire impacts for kind of the worst over the next 3 to 5 years. But as the watershed areas recover and vegetation starts to regrow, then that risk goes down every year after that. So I welcome any questions you may have, and I'm here as long as you need. Yeah,
Do you have any information on the Gurney Creek?
Gurney,
Yeah, Gurney or Gurney?
Gurney?
It's the one that runs on, by the estuary there, at the head of the lake.
Flows into Okanagan Lake, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, no,
Comes off
that's a good
Irish
thing,
Creek.
I guess.
it may not have been affected by fire, or I may not know the name of it. All the creeks are mapped, and any fan areas are mapped. If the headwaters of that creek were affected by the fire, then it might have higher flows. But it depends on the area affected and whether it was at high burn severity.
I don't know where it originates.
Yeah, we can look on the map after, but I think that the creeks in the valley bottom here are fairly robust because so much of the water infiltrates into the valley bottom. So it's not funneled down a valley to a fan. The fan area is very flat,
Right.
so, yeah.
Pretty.
Yeah, yeah. Anybody else have any questions?
So does it seem like there's a real potential for issues this spring, or does it appear like it's more calmed down and people can sort of relax a little bit, or should we be on major high alert?
Those living on the fans in the large watersheds like Whiteman, Oswego, Aquesus will be watching for the snow melt peak, which will be mid-May, late May. Because the floods on those creeks are driven by snow melt. In this area, where events are typically triggered by rainstorms, you're gonna wanna be aware of that. You know, if you see, intense rainstorms coming through, and they typically occur July, August, September, then those would be of concern. And, I wanna point out that you live here, you know what the creeks look like on a day-to-day basis. And so you're the best ones to observe and take note of any changes that don't look right. So if the creek near your property is flowing brown, and it normally is quite clear, then that's worth worrying about and phoning OKIB office or Ministry of Transportation to get somebody to look at it.
Do you have telephone numbers for these?
I do not. But, sorry, there's some information at the table there that talks about what to do, and it does have some contact numbers.
And Jack, if folks go to the OKIB webpage, right in the front there's a
Okay.
contact us button, they can
Okay.
click there and it has numbers for all the different
I
departments.
knew I saw it somewhere, so yes, thank you. I know OKB's got some emergency response information that is being distributed, so yes, the OKIB website. Hmm?
It's on here too.
Okay, good. So there is some handout material at the desk there for you. So, yeah, like I said, so you make note of unusual water patterns. If water is flowing where it never flowed before, or if you see water flowing across West Side Road, that's not normal and should notify the appropriate people.
If we see something unusual or maybe some blockage, are the resources available to have them cleaned out, or do we take it upon ourselves to do that, or do we call first?
If it's on private property, it's the onus of the property owner. If it's on a public highway, it's MOT. If it's on band land, I would contact the band to find out how best to do that.
And just keeping in mind your safety, personal safety, right? If you start playing around and unblocking something and you get a high flow resulting in yourself, so you should always just call, and, cause we'll have the proper equipment and people to deal with stuff.
It's always best to call.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When is MOTI, do you know when MOTI, the transportation ministry is supposed to look at our street culverts and stuff? No?
I report it to them weekly.
You do? Okay, yeah, 'cause I know Rivers had issues there.
Yeah.
Back behind Uncle Wiles, there's a creek ate away a big chunk of the bank there and just washed, like, it's deep back there now. Where it was, like, it wasn't very deep, one year, and it got washed out quite bad. And then also at Lyle's house, like, they had to, Muckleberry had to go away and dig, ditches with the skid steer, because it was pretty bad, his culverts just got handled when it comes down there, even with, in a normal year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I report that.
Yeah, and I think, so we had a gentleman go out and assess up by Herbies, I think there's some work planned in there before freshet. So we've submitted for funding to do something up there, cause it's been flooding since 2017,
Yeah.
he's had an issue there, so.
Yeah, it's pretty bad too there.
Yeah.
Would you happen to know if there are any, plans for planting trees to replace some of the, ones that were, destroyed, or anything to help hold the soil?
I know that restoration work has taken place on the fire guards that were, bladed. The burned areas, not that I know of, some areas were seeded. And it might depend on whether it's on band land versus, crown land. Typically, the forest is left to come back on its own.
On natural?
So on the crown land, so if the forest company harvests, goes in and salvages some of the burn wood, they'll replant them areas. But they do not go into where they're not getting return, I guess, where they can't cut the trees and make some money. They don't do those areas. But we are working on, with the province, trying to get funding for a restoration plan, especially for the riparian. So to be able to replant some of the riparian areas next to the creeks, like more of the White Man's Beulah, because they were so severely burned, so.
Yeah.
And there's also a program through the federal government, it's called 2 Million Trees, so that funding program allows you access to funding to get trees to plant, so. It's all kind of, there's a big picture and a bunch of talking and planning going around, so, yeah.
Cause your specialty is the flooding side of things, right?
Flooding and landslide.
Yeah, cause I was just wondering, cause we're new. What is burnt in the White Rock fire? Is that have a potential to burn again and continue further? Or in these kind of scenarios, is that sort of a done deal now and fire will happen somewhere else?
I think the risk is very much lower when it's already been burned, because there's no fuel left to burn again. So maybe it depends on the level of burn severity. That's not my specialty, so I don't know that. Yeah,
That
it's-
slope there, if you look, and it's just got patches of burnt,
Yeah.
for sure that can burn again.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Right, because it
for
still
sure.
has fuel and it didn't burn clean, but if you look at Newport Creek where it's just black and burnt, the chances are pretty slim of
Yeah.
anything happening there. So, and then it did stop, right? So up above us, there's a whole forest that didn't burn, so,
That
didn't burn, no, it stopped partway through the watershed, so,
They did some back burning here, we saw
Yeah.
that.
yeah.
So that wasn't a full burn, it was just ground burn, wasn't it?
No, they were pretty severe burn, that's what that slope is there, with all the black on it. So it's probably 70% loss.
Thank you.
yeah, those areas are shown on the map too. The colors show what was burned at what level.
guess being new, I can ask more questions.
Yeah, of course.
We've noticed the estuary has dried out substantially. It's not like it used to be. And there's a lot of the land is actually, you can see where it's flat now, and you can see, you can probably walk on it, although you might go up to your knees, but there was a time when you couldn't do that. So are they looking at that kind of stuff? Because that's now all fairly dry as a grass burn. It could be susceptible to some sort of event. Is that being done?
The lake was outside my scope of work because it's, you know, the receiving body of water. So I didn't look at, you know, potential flooding effects on the lake. The lake did have, flooding in 2017, fairly severely, and, since that time, you know, the lake level's been a bit lower, and they're low right now, seasonally. So it fluctuates year to year, and it's a managed lake, so, at Penticton, they control the levels.
So it could come up, but it could go down even more. It's just depends on how
It'll
you
go
measure.
up.
Yeah, it'll go up from now.
It's left
Through the
low
spring.
right now to allow room, space for all the water that's gonna come through the freshet. And it generally comes,
Oh.
it'll generally